Our winters are harsh here in Saskatchewan, and there are many folks who like to leave out food to help out hungry animals. But what happens when animals become dependent on this food? Today on Blue Sky, we are digging into the relationship between people and wild animals. We'll tell you about a Regina neighborhood that is deeply divided about feeding the squirrels. We'll talk about wild birds and deer baiting, and why campgrounds often have signs stating a fat bear is a dead bear. And as always, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a time when wild animals maybe got a little too friendly with humans? How did that happen? And what did that relationship result in? You can call us today at 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, squirrels, they can be very divisive little creatures. Some people see them as pests, and some people love them so much that they feed them expensive walnuts. On this week's episode of This is Saskatchewan podcast, host Leisha Grabinski digs into the drama in one Regina neighborhood with reporter Chris Edwards. Here's a bit of that story.
I felt that it was important to tell people about what's going on in Broders Annex because it does speak to an age-old neighborhood conundrum, which is how do we all live happily together with our neighbors?
Yes, tell me more. So first off, what kind of neighborhood is Broders Annex?
Broders Annex is it's just southeast of downtown. It's a pretty established neighborhood with many small bungalows built just before and right after the war. It's also a neighborhood where we're starting to see more infill development. You could also say that it's a hop, skip, and jump away from the Milky Way, which is a well-known ice cream shop here in Regina.
Okay, now I can picture it. But what exactly are neighbors concerned about?
Well, several Reddit users say that someone in the Broders Annex neighborhood is feeding squirrels whole walnuts.
And is that a big deal?
Have you looked at Reddit?
I've dug up so many damn walnuts while gardening. This person's walnut budget is insane. I find them in my gardens, garage, bushes. My friends think I'm crazy. Who has this much of a walnut supply?
I think my neighbor may be one of the walnut culprits. Do I call directly to the SWAT team to deal with her, or will the 911 operator direct my call?
Please stop. I have had to pull these out of my dog's mouths 10 plus times this summer because squirrels have been burying them all over my yard. Please switch to peanuts like normal people.
I really hope you guys get this resolved, but this is one of the funniest neighborhood problems I've seen in a while.
Okay, so we've got a squirrel issue, a walnut issue, I should say. Why did this thread pop up a couple weeks ago?
Well, the theory, and I want to emphasize that it is a theory, is that the problem is growing.
And is that it? Like, what are people saying in real life?
Well, Parker Gusway, who's one of the people who lives in the neighborhood, isn't sure it's a growing problem. I spoke to him when I canvassed the neighborhood, but he does say that it has been a thing for a few years.
I've just seen squirrels going up and down the power line squirrel highway with walnuts for years now. I found them in my backyard a bunch of times. They're all over the neighborhood.
Squirrel highway right through Broders Annex. Is there anything in the squirrel behavior that suggests they are indeed being fed walnuts?
Well, number one, the squirrels that I saw were pretty fat. That could be just, it's the fall and they're getting ready for winter. Number two, people do keep finding walnuts. I saw plenty myself. And number three, Parker Gusway says he finds them everywhere in his backyard, in his front yard, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, they're under cushions or plants or in the grass, everywhere. Especially come winter, they're everywhere. Yeah, it's kind of a nuisance. It's not really that big of a deal, I don't think, but.
But is he talking about patio furniture cushions? Is that what he means?
That is what he means, but like he said, he doesn't think it's a big deal the way people, at least on Reddit, do.
Okay, fair. But who do they know who is behind the walnut caches?
We don't know for sure. And we don't have any definitive evidence to suggest the walnuts are coming from a particular house, despite what's said online. But believe me, I canvassed the neighborhood. I spent almost an entire day there, and it was suggested that the epicenter of the walnut droppings might be near the intersection of College Avenue and Broder Street.
But again, is this Is this bad?
Well, that's a good question. I thought I would seek out a real authority on this, so I spoke with Veronica Schroeder, who coordinates forestry, pest control, and horticulture with the City of Regina. And yes, her response to this was actually pretty simple.
Please don't feed wildlife.
Yes, Veronica's concern is not just squirrels, by the way.
We don't want people feeding wildlife like squirrels or raccoons or any other wild animal, because that just encourages them to come back and become dependent on people. So we want them to be independent animals and be concerned about humans and be able to live their best lives on their own.
Right. So that's all well and good, but, the crux of this is this growing? So I did have to ask, are squirrels in general, at least from the perspective of the City of Regina, a growing problem?
We have not heard of squirrels being prolific in the past. They are not a regulated pest under the Pest Control Act in Saskatchewan, so we don't really monitor them or try and deal with them in any way.
Okay, yeah, squirrels are not rats. Rats are a pest. Squirrels are not rats. On the Reddit thread, though, I noticed people were also concerned about people because some people have nut allergies and they could come in contact with these walnuts.
Yeah, it is a concern, certainly, and I asked Veronica about that as well, and she said that it shouldn't really be a concern, especially because it's unlikely that walnuts will last into the spring. One, because they break down. Two, because the squirrels are eating them. But at the same time, lots of kids and adults do have nut allergies, and it's true that we do need to be cognizant of that.
Right, which is why Veronica maintains don't do it.
Exactly.
So what if someone is really concerned about the number of squirrels in their yard?
Well, number one, Veronica said, don't call the city. If it is a concern, a resident can call a pest control company to take a look. And now if there is an infestation of squirrels at a city park, that's a different story. It's a public place. The city, it is their responsibility to take care of that. And so the city will go take a look at that. But again, we're not talking about mice or rats. We're talking about cute squirrels. So here's Veronica's take on that.
Every animal and insect is beneficial to our ecosystem to some capacity. I am not a squirrel expert, but we should just appreciate and respect nature as the human beings that we are. Even if we're superior, they have a purpose. So be kind, but if they're a problem, call your pest control company.
Chris, thank you for this story.
You bet, Alicia.
There was an excerpt from the most recent episode of the This is Saskatchewan podcast. Our thanks to the CBC's Chris Edwards and Alicia Krabinski for the story. You can hear the rest of the episode on Spotify, Apple, CBC Listen, and wherever you get your podcasts. And today on the show, we talk about humans and wildlife living together, the relationship we have with one another. And of course, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a time when wild animals got maybe a little too friendly with humans? How did that happen? And what did that relationship result in? You can call us today at 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Now, we've been talking about and hearing what maybe not to do, but there are things you can do if you want to help wildlife. Ducks Unlimited provides financial incentives for programs that preserve, protect, and restore habitat on the land for wildlife and waterfowl. Trevor Plews is head of conservation programs for Saskatchewan Ducks Unlimited Canada, and he joins us now. Hello, Trevor, and thanks for your time today.
Oh, not a problem. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, we're switching now a little bit from squirrels to birds, especially migrating birds. I understand they need food and places to rest on their long journey. So what exactly are they looking for?
Right. From Ducks Limited's perspective, our program is designed to basically address some of the needs or some of the lacking features in their life cycle. And in the prairies, we've seen a lot of changes on the landscape. And what we're trying to do is find the win-win opportunities with agriculture so we can maybe address needs, whether it be opportunities for enhanced food source or, more importantly, restoration and preservation of some of the habitats that Saskatchewan has so much for migrating and wildlife that waterfowl that exist or maintain their life cycle during the summer here.
And I want to talk a little more about how farmers can help in the programs, but you touched on the changes that affect the birds. What kind of changes, like what are some of the examples that make it harder for them?
Well, for sure. If you look over the last 50 or even 100 years, the change in Saskatchewan's landscape has changed dramatically. I mean, we used to be very prairie-based, and grain production has now become more and more of a commonplace. So what was once there for wildlife is maybe now brought into production. But that doesn't mean it always has to be negative towards wildlife. There are lots of places where we can overlay and find the win-win solutions that can provide habitat, and also work with a producer or farmer's grain or ranching operation to enhance the opportunities for wildlife and biodiversity.
So if farmers and ranchers want to help waterfowl, how can they do that? What can they do?
There's actually quite a few things, and that's part of our role at Ducks Unlimited, is to identify the opportunities where we can find those win-wins. Typically, wildlife are looking for some sort of water source, for a food source, obviously, as well as a place for protection and for concealment. The other thing they're looking for is a place for nesting. And that's usually some sort of cover that's there in the spring that provides a place for nesting, a place for concealment so they can lay their eggs and actually be successful in rearing off their broods and so forth. So those are the sort of the strategic things or key parts of their life cycle that we try to look for. And the success for waterfowl production and ongoing maintenance of our resources to be finding those solutions and opportunities that are on the land in Saskatchewan. And producers and farmers have a tremendous amount of landscapes and habitat. So we're just trying to tweak things or find those opportunities where we can coexist and have those type of programs.
Let's look specifically at some programs so we can describe it a little better of how that could look, instead of just imagining that the bird is nesting in the middle of the field that is an active farmer's field. I understand you have the Forage Incentive Program. How does that work?
Yeah, you don't have enough time for me. I'm so motivated. The programs have changed over the last 20 or 30 years to work with producers. It's incredible. The forage program is targeted in Saskatchewan into certain landscapes that have a high density of wetlands and traditionally have a high historical population of waterfowl. So we tried it because conservation dollars are somewhat limited. So we try to focus in on areas that have the most opportunity, most bang for your buck, if you want to call it that. So what we're looking for is areas that have a high density of wetlands, but also the next limiting factor, something we can enhance, is trying to create that cover. And forages, whether that be for hay or for pasture, are seeded on cultivated land and obviously harvested as pasture or for with livestock or for forage. But that emerging cover is typically enough cover in the spring to provide habitat to draw in various species of waterfowl and other upland birds into that area where they'd like to nest, and they like to have that cover there as it grows throughout the season as concealment, so they can actually lay all their eggs and successfully rear their young from there. So that's what we're trying to do, is see more and more of that type of land into grass.
And remind me, what's the benefit for the farmer to do that and join the program?
A lot of cases, producers are looking for that forage for feedstuff for their livestock. So maybe their cattle operation needs to expand their pastures. They need more spring pasture or late season. Or in some cases, you just need to convert some of these lands for hay stuff so they can harvest them and feed them over the winter. What's been really neat in the last couple of years is as GU, with all this new technology, is really trying to find within a grain production, where if a producer isn't in the need for that feed and maybe doesn't have livestock, maybe there's areas within their land base that isn't as profitable as they'd like. And that's something that we've been trying to refine over the last couple of years, exactly where they are within producers' land base. And maybe it makes economic sense in those cases to put those acres into grass. If they're maybe in negative margin, they're not producing as well as they'd like with some grain crops, the next alternative is to put it into grass. And we've been pretty successful in the last couple of years identifying, and more importantly, maybe offering some assistance, whether it be financial or coordination of the equipment, to bring it in to see these small fragmented acres into forage. And they obviously have some benefits for feedstuffs, but they're very important as well because they do provide some habitat for us for the spring. And in a lot of cases, it's such a win-win that the producer maybe not receiving as much dollars or return, but putting it in the grass would be the next best alternative.
And I just want to remind our listeners, if you want to join the conversation today, we talk about humans and wildlife living together, the relationships we have, the not so good, but also the positives, and how we can help wildlife without harming them. If you have ever experienced a time when wild animals got a little too friendly with humans, maybe you run a farm and have taken part in one of those programs to help waterfowl, you can call us at 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. I'm wondering about those programs and incentives that you described. I'm wondering if farmers need to worry if they're doing things to encourage more birds and wildlife to their land. And in that sense, are they inviting potential wildlife damage to their crops? What's your take on that?
I guess there's always that element of risk, but to be honest, I don't see that really being a concern. I mean, the waterfowl damage that maybe have happened in the past was more significant in past years. Now with improved technology and harvesting, that type of issue really isn't as big as we once saw. And there's obviously some compensation programs that are available if waterfowl numbers ever or other wildlife species increase to that level. I think there's more opportunity to see an increase in waterfowl production and other wildlife species without really negatively impacting the landscape to any large extent at all.
Do you have an idea how many farmers in Saskatchewan take part in your forage incentive program or marginal areas program?
Yeah, they're actually quite popular. We typically try to work with 300 to 500 producers every year, and that would help convert roughly 30,000 acres of land into forage. And that's obviously available to the producers to use for feed or for pasture. So it's continuing to be very popular. It's one of those programs that they receive benefit of the feed stuff and we receive the biodiversity thing. So it's really a nice win-win opportunity.
I understand you're also doing some other innovative things, for example, with drone seeding. What is that all about?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so one of our programs has been called this Marginal Areas Program, which is a forage program, but it's really targeted to areas within a grain producers or annual crop land base where maybe it's 2 acres here, 5 acres there, 2 acres there. They're scattered throughout the field that, again, going back, maybe isn't as profitable as they would like. Maybe they're prone to either flooding damage, maybe the salinity issues, or sometimes because the equipment is so large, it's hard to get into these acres. And a lot of times it's just not economical to try to go in. So what we've tried to do is create a program called Marginal Areas to provide that financial incentive and to protect the grass. But we've learned very quickly that producers, they may have that every intention and the ability to try to get it done. However, we have such a narrow window of seeding that producers can't often stop what they're doing just to seed these 3 or 4 acres within their fields. So we've come up with an idea, and it seems to be working, is to bring the equipment onto the land base to actually help convert them to those acres to grass. And drones are one mechanism that wasn't out there maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but it's a registered use where you can actually bring this equipment and service apply the forage seed so it can get into these acres. And we typically will do that either early in the spring or even actually this time of year in the late October, where we can actually get it on the ground and to get it incorporated. So it helps the producer get these acres converted quickly. The nice part about the drones, it's very quick, very efficient, and you can really target exactly where you want it to be done. And more importantly, it offers a service to farmers who don't want to hook up a drill this time of year to seed 3 to 5 acres. It's a very laborious attempt this time of year to seed. So anything we can do to help facilitate that is what we would like to do.
Before I let you go, Trevor, we only have about a minute left or so. Waterway conservation programs can safely support wildlife. And I'm thinking beyond waterfowl. I'm thinking pollinators. I know there's pollinator gardens, nesting birds. How can we safely support wildlife with those kind of programs?
Well, I think the big thing is to communicate. I realize there's so many different programs for various agencies. If you're a landowner or farmer, it is hard to keep track of that. Our goal within Ducks Limit is to make sure producers are aware of all the opportunities, what do the programs mean, and how they can be integrated within their land base, again, to be a win-win situation. And then our goal is to actually see all these programs fully saturated in the landscape so that producers can take advantage of them And don't get me wrong, the byproduct will be biodiversity. So to me, it's a win-win. And we truly want to see farmers take advantage of whatever programs are. And more importantly, if there are things there that they're doing that we're not even aware of, is an opportunity to evolve our programs to be integrated more so in the ag landscape. So we're not experts in everything, but if producers can show us and tell us a little bit more what would they like to see, we can try to evolve with that as well and try to become a future program.
Trevor, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
And I want to share an email from Keith with you. Keith wrote, humans are destroying wildlife habitat at an alarming rate, so there will be more and more interactions with people. In Churchill, Manitoba, they've learned to live in close proximity with our largest carnivore polar bears. In India, many people are killed by tigers, and yet they've learned to protect them. We need raptors, coyotes, foxes, weasels, and all carnivores to control rodents, and yet we persecute the predators and then complain when rodents explode. Nature functions fine. We are the problem. Keith, thank you very much for that email. And I think it's a perfect introduction to bring in our next guest, Shelley Alexander. Earlier this year, City Council in Saskatchewan approved a wildlife feeding ban for the community. The only exception, bird feeders on private property, so for example, in your backyard. The city says the regulations aim to help reduce conflicts and promote a respectful coexistence with urban wildlife. Some of the reason behind the decision in Saskatchewan was the concern around coyotes. Last year, Saskatchewan saw an explosion in the number of coyote sightings. So we are bringing in Shelley Alexander. She has decades of experience studying human-wildlife contact, specializing in the mammals. She's a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Calgary. Good afternoon, Shelley, and welcome to Blue Sky.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Shelley, I want to focus on coyotes. When do they start becoming a problem for a city?
Well, I want to backtrack just to the bird feeder comment that you made, which I think is just fantastic that there's some regulation on that, because what underscores conflict with a lot of our wildlife species, but specifically with coyotes, is when they get into what we call attractants, so food like bird seed. So one of the things we found in the research here on the diet was they were getting into foods like that. And when they get into foods like that are the attractants, that brings them in contact with us. And so when coyotes, when we start to see problems or challenges arising with coyotes, it relates to them 100% of the time. It relates to them getting into human sources of food and getting too close and getting dependent on that food source.
So then I guess us humans are causing that problem. But I understand there are some specific times of the year when the coyotes might be, maybe let's call it a little more sensitive or cautious. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at when the patterns of conflict occur, those tend to occur. There'll be a little bit of a spike when in end of January, February, when the coyotes they're moving around, they're trying to get back together with their mate, and then they'll breed. And so they can be very protective of their mates during that period of time. So there's usually a little blip then. But the biggest spike we get is when the pups are born. Their number one job as an animal is to reproduce and then to protect those young at all costs. And they're a very tight family unit, and they will protect those pups. So we see that the pups are born usually around mid-April. And so between mid-April and around August, if dogs get too close to the pups or the pups are vulnerable, they're out in the open and moving, so they'll usually move those puppies somewhere right around the end of May. If the pups are vulnerable, that's when we'll see conflict arise. So that's usually our biggest spike, is during that pup rearing phase, specifically end of May, June. And then right now they are dispersing. So all those young that were born this year will be having to leave the family for the first time. And so what we tend to see at this time of year, October, November, is conflicts that arise. We'll get a small spike, and it is to do with these animals that are leaving the family. They're young. They can be a little bit confused. They are often very fearful. And the big deal right now is that they can get into easy food. So if you're leaving out bird seed or dog food or even like crab apples, even on the tree, those things, they'll get used to eating those, and we don't. So we want to make sure those things aren't available for them right now.
So coming back to the problem of easy food available, and I'm wondering, this brings me to my next question. Now, coyote sightings in Saskatoon have notably increased in recent years. Is that the only leading cause that we are just, we're like an easy all-you-can-eat buffet here in the cities?
No. Yeah, so there's, without being in that environment, I can't tell you exactly what's going on, but there are patterns here that occur in all cities, fairly similar. So when it's coyotes are living around us in cities all the time. And so when they get into conflict is when they start finding those easy food sources. But when there's actually an event where somebody is bitten, those are very, very rare, but those are 100% linked to somebody actually feeding those coyotes across Canada. But what happens when we tend to see these sort of spikes in observations, or everybody's reporting that they're having some kind of conflict, there's usually something has happened in that landscape. So there's been a disturbance, and that's very common. In the spring, you may have a development gets put in. Those displace the coyotes from areas where they've been hiding and living amongst us. And so suddenly they're exposed. So that's one of the key things that happens. The food then it adds on to that, but it's also on its own, no matter whether there's disturbance going on, that's a precursor to conflict.
And I want to quickly give out our number again for people can join the conversation, or maybe they have some specific questions. We are talking about wild animals and humans living together, our relationships, and we want to know if you've ever experienced a time when wild animals got a little too friendly with humans. Maybe you had an encounter with a coyote or any other wildlife. How did that happen? What did that relationship result in? You can call us 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. And going back to you, Shelley, you mentioned this is not just Saskatoon. There's other cities as well. You live in Calgary. I want to look now a little bit at the solutions more. So what do other cities, what do cities in Canada do when they see an increase in coyotes?
So often what this is an increase in people reporting coyotes versus an actual increase in the coyotes themselves, or the coyotes have become visible. So just to clarify that. But what we're seeing more and more is municipalities are creating coexistence programs. And a coexistence program would involve something like you described Saskatoon doing, putting a bird seed policy in place. So where you're trying to stop the attractants, and you're using education as sort of the baseline to coexist. So there's greater desire for that we're seeing across North America, across the world, but North American, across Canadian cities. So and then with the education programs, there are some pretty key steps around what to do. Make sure your yard is clean. Make sure you don't have those kinds of attractants. Make sure you don't feed any wildlife, right? There's those sort of regulations that cities will put in. And usually you can, go to a city's, like City of Calgary has a website. I have an education website as well for this, but, and that'll give you the step-by-step guide. In the case that an animal has become food conditioned, then there are certain things that will signal that. But there's basic stuff you can do too, like at those high conflict times of year, be more aware, realize these animals are mostly fearful. Make sure your dogs are on leash if you're in an area where there's coyotes showing up. Dogs are a competitor for a coyote, and especially if there's pups around, they're very protective of that. So keeping dogs on leash where they need to be leashed, being aware, see a coyote, it's there, keep that dog on leash, keep it close to you. And then just learn that I find that for people, it's very empowering once they realize that these animals will move away from you if you just do things like stop. If you see a coyote, you stop. You give it the space to move. If for some reason it's approaching you, you can do things like put your hands in the air, clap very loudly, and say, "Get out of here," and give that animal time to digest that message, and then it will leave. But I think the biggest message is just give them the space to do what they need to do and move on. We don't want them in our backyards, obviously, but give them the space to move away from you, and recognize that they are trying to stay in this landscape and stay away from us.
Shelley, there were a lot of great tips. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Shelley Alexander is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Calgary. And I want to remind you before we bring in our next guest, we love to hear from you. What are your experiences with wildlife? Have you ever experienced a time when a wild animal became maybe a little too close and it was a bit of a scary situation? Or are you someone who loves to see them around? What kind of wildlife do you have in your neighborhood? You can call us at 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. Ryan Brook pays very close attention to how wild animals interact with humans and urban environments. He's a professor and graduate chair at the USask Department of Animal and Poultry Science. And Ryan is on the line now. Hello, Ryan, and welcome to Blue Sky.
Hello.
Ryan, I want to go back a little bit to some smaller animals. We started our show today with talk about people feeding squirrels in Regina, allegedly. But it's not just squirrels that people feed. We heard about the damage it can cause when you feed coyotes. What do you hear about the problems with people feeding wildlife?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that a lot of people like to do, and the general assumption is that they're helping. They're giving food to animals that need the food. The reality is that animals don't need that food, and a lot of it isn't particularly good for them. There's been, some recent research in Ontario looking at overweight raccoons with heart disease and problems and obesity. From being fed, and lots of issues around health that come from it. And so, as a general rule, I'm not a big supporter of feeding wildlife in general. There are some exceptions. Certainly bird feeders with seed, I think, is perfectly fine. But there's no real mammals that I would certainly support feeding. And again, mainly because there's no need for it, and also because it causes all kinds of different problems that stem from it.
You've looked into how wild animals move about our city. What got you thinking about this in the first place?
Well, we've been really interested in wildlife-human interactions my whole career, and that's been my focus, is this the role that people play in animals and how they support them, and the benefits they bring and the joy that we get from wildlife, but also some of the challenges and harms that we can get from wildlife or that we can cause to wildlife. And so I've been looking at this for 30 years now in various aspects, from polar bears and caribou along the Hudson Bay coast into the city. And so we were invited to start looking at research here in Saskatoon. And so in 2020, we started putting out trail cameras around the city, and we've been running these year round. And so Katie Harris, my PhD student, ran 30 cameras for 3 full years and is currently analyzing all of the data. And what's great about trail cameras is they don't just look at one individual species. They capture everything that comes by, and certainly been incredibly interesting to see how different animals respond to different things in the city with respect to temperature and other aspects of human activity.
Do you have some examples of what you and your PhD student saw on those trail cams, like what you discovered?
Well, one of the more exciting things that we've seen, we saw a black bear once, which was quite interesting within the city limits, and that's not typical for a prairie city like Saskatoon. So that was
and
wild.
Whereabouts, if I may ask, in the city?
That was on the extreme west end of the city, and it was in a little plot of forest. And yeah, the animal was, we got several photos of it feeding on aspen. It had ripped down branches off an aspen tree and was stripping off the leaves and eating them. The other thing that we actually just published a paper on was looking at moose occurrences in the city of Saskatoon. And again, that's rather unique and actually somewhat troubling. There's lots of wildlife that I would say are very compatible with humans, and so most of the songbirds and squirrels and these kinds of things, people like to see them. There's not a lot of issues, not big concerns overall. But when you start to get to things like bears and indeed moose, then we start to talk about public safety issue. And I would say, I think we generally feel that there are some species that just can't coexist with us. It's just not going to work. The only opportunity or the only real response is to move them out of the city. And that's essentially the strategy in Saskatoon, is if there's a problem moose, the provincial guys will come out and dart it and move it down to Blackstrap or other areas outside of the city.
So I'm curious, and I remember that moose story jumping through the window. That was quite something into a school, elementary school, I think it was. So removing the animal, but what brings wild animals like moose, like bears, into the city in the first place? Is it just the food, the easy access to food?
Food, but also one of the things that is not compatible with people is hunting. And so one thing you will never see walking around the city of Saskatoon is a hunter. And so that is a safe zone from being shot at. And that, if you go into rural Saskatchewan, there are lengthy hunting seasons for various species that can be quite detrimental to their survival. And so food is part of it, but a major aspect also is getting away from hunting pressure. And Saskatoon is one of the few places where there's absolutely no hunting of any kind within the city limits for any animals. And so I think moose are capitalizing on that as well, because certainly in the southern half of Saskatchewan, we certainly see much more mortality from hunters than we would from predators, because of course we don't have much in the way of large predators in and around Saskatoon or anywhere south from there.
I want to quickly remind folks, if you want to join the conversation, if you have a question about wildlife in the city, wildlife interactions, wherever you live in Saskatchewan, and maybe share your experience when you were maybe a little nervous when you ran into a wild animal, you can call us 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. And it's interesting you bring up hunting, Ryan, because if we move a little bit out of the city, and it's hunting season in some parts of the province. So how often do you hear about people baiting game?
Yeah, that's been widespread and common across the prairies. And so it can be a little subtle, and people may argue different, but baiting versus feeding is a little different in terms of objective, right? Feeding tend to be the objective is to help sustain populations through hard winters and subsidize their diet, whereas baiting is specifically putting out some kind of food items or often salt blocks, mineral salt blocks, to attract hunters. And that's very, very widespread across the province. There are regulations around it, but it is certainly common for many different kinds of hunting. And that, can increase hunter success, but also comes with risks and impacts. Anytime you're putting food out for animals, you're creating impacts. And so one of the things, for example, with deer in winter that we run into is that, unlike us, a deer has a 4-part stomach. And so they digest food differently than we do. And so in the middle of winter, when they're mostly eating dry grass and getting by on what they can find, if they get access to really high quality hay or grain that people put out, that can actually cause what we call rumen overload and make them sick and can even kill them. And so that's just one example of many negative impacts that can have. And again, this general assumption saying we're putting out food, this is good for them, good for us, that is certainly not the case. And probably, I would say, certainly in most cases, that's not true.
So you say baiting is okay if you follow the rules, but feeding, especially larger animals, wildlife, is not necessarily good, even if you're thinking you're helping. Did I catch you right there?
Yeah, I think, anytime you're putting food out, you create risks and impacts. Whether you call that, baiting or feeding, or even some farm producers will do what we call, peripheral feeding. So you put a couple of hay bales around the edge of the farm to keep your elk and deer from coming right into the haystacks and interacting with livestock. So there's a different objectives and ways of putting out feed for animals, especially in the winter when it's often felt they need it the most. But anytime you're putting out any kind of artificial food, then there are some potential benefits, but many implications around disease transmission. These concentrated high quality food sites become really important sites for things like chronic wasting disease. And as you may know, Saskatchewan is the epicenter for chronic wasting. We have the highest prevalence on the planet, and it is continuing to completely spread out of control with not a whole lot really slowing it down at this point. And baiting and feeding is no doubt a major part of that and continues to be a major unaddressed part of the issue. And why that hasn't been addressed is, I guess, a big open question in my mind.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that. I'm wondering, you mentioned the farmers kind of putting out hay to prevent wildlife coming too close. I'm wondering how much damage do elk, deer, etc. cause to farmers? I'm thinking fields, hay bales in yard, etc.
Oh, damage is very, very high. Saskatchewan crop insurance provides compensation for wildlife losses, and you don't have to buy that. You just are, as any producer in Saskatchewan, you would be automatically eligible for impacts from any wildlife. And those claims overall for wildlife each year earn many, many millions of dollars paid out. And so this is a huge, widespread, ongoing issue and has been since 1880 when the first farmers started putting crops out, and continues to be the state. And so this is an ongoing issue for sure, a big, big issue that, again, it's the loss to the producer, but then access to some of these crops cause problems in all sorts of other ways. So arguably one of the bigger wildlife issues in Saskatchewan, and hasn't been a whole lot really done to address it that I've seen so far for reasons, again, that aren't clear to me.
Okay, that was kind of my next question. What would be the answer to, reducing that damage? And I guess it's also,
when I talk to farmers about this, one of the things that I really emphasize is that take a toolbox approach to this rather than thinking there's one magic silver bullet. Reality is that every farm is different and every situation is different. And so looking at every farmer has a great big toolbox and they're shed somewhere full of every kind of tool you can imagine. And that's how we think of elk and deer or wolves depredating on livestock or any of these issues, is that there's a whole bunch of options. Fencing is always, I teach a third-year class starting in January called Animals, Agriculture, and the Environment here at the University of Saskatchewan. And one of my sort of running jokes is that for any of my quizzes, fencing and education are always good answers for most of my questions because those are really effective, they're cost effective, they're usually quite cheap, and you don't have to explain to farmers why fencing is a good option. They get fencing, they know fencing better than anyone. And so fencing to keep elk and deer and other wildlife out of hay bales or grain piles or other things can be very effective. Electric fencing, large, what we call a barrier fence, like a 10-foot high, super duper fence with telephone poles and wire can be super effective. We've seen producers have those, and that eliminates all their problems for 25 years. And then obviously is highly cost effective and covers all the thousands of dollars in losses. So those are good moves. There can be short term, there's you can buy a scary man device that is actually literally a thing that kind of waves its arms around with flashing lights and things. And you can use blood meal from a slaughterhouse that will scare away a lot of elk and deer. So there are many, many things that can be done. Livestock guardian dogs are highly effective. So these aren't your pets that sleep in your house. These are animals that stay with the herd and live with the herd and are part of the herd, and they will scare away wildlife coming in as well. So, we've got all the options in the world. It just doesn't seem to be a priority to implement those yet. But I would certainly, it would save our province. I mean, we are spending tens of millions of dollars every year on these losses without putting really a lot of effort into preventing it. So I think that's a real opportunity.
We covered a lot of ground here, and I have a lot of follow-up questions, but unfortunately we are coming towards the end of the show. So my last question, we only have about 45 seconds left. How can we learn people and animals, how can we coexist in a healthy way and help animals or not without causing too many problems?
Well, I think you have to ask a question. First of all, is feeding something that is really necessary? Are you actually helping when you put out food for animals for whatever the objective? And often, I would say at least 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, you're not actually helping over the long term in the big picture because of all the other impacts. And so I would say that would be the core message, is just to think twice about whether putting out any kind of food is really needed or not. And, again, a bird feeder is perfectly harmless and good in all kinds of ways. And they're, putting a hummingbird feeder, what impact is that going to have? But when you start putting out food for large mammals and you're starting to see bears and elk and deer and wolves and coyotes and things coming specifically to food you're putting out, then most times that's going to create more problems than it's going to fix.
Ryan, this was really interesting. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Take care, Teresa.
That's all our time today. Ryan Brook is a professor and graduate chair at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Agriculture and Bioresources.